And welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Over the Seawall, the Delusion of Controlling Nature, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network and Island Press. My name is Jill Lemke and I serve as the Manager of Engagement and Partnerships at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The Smart Growth Network website is currently undergoing a transition. Please stay tuned for updates. Today's webinar is one in a series of webinars hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov or by using our YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities, and includes links to past and future webinars. We encourage you to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speaker are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the state of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits, or in this case, 1 Sustainability and Resilience credit from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for the event number 928-8880. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by opening the Q&A tool in the Zoom control panel. Now I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Stephen Miller is an author and journalist whose reporting and essays on climate change, conservation, and agriculture have appeared in National Geographic, The Washington Post, The New Republic, The Guardian, Discover Magazine, Sierra Magazine, Audubon, Huffington Post, and many others. Stephen was born in Pittsburgh, was educated in life and academia in Tucson, Arizona, and has since bounced around the American West seeking out complex stories and imperfect heroes. Whether writing about invasive pigs in the American South, dengue fever in Bangladesh, drying farms in Arizona, plastic pollution, electric trains, gemstone mining, the Green Revolution, or wildfires, he strives to present the perspectives of people who live the stories as much as those who call the shots. Miller is a 2018 to 2019 TED Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he also teaches science writing. Stephen studied journalism at the University of Arizona and now lives in Northern Colorado, with his wife and son and an old motorcycle. As someone who studied journalism and loves reading about science, I'm very excited to turn it over to Stephen. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Jill. Thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. Make sure I got mine going on here. I should also say that I spent some time in Towson. I went to Towson University for a short time, for a year, and studied some journalism there. And I lived in DC for a little while as well. So I'm slightly familiar with the area. So I appreciate you having me. It's really fascinating to talk with folks who are working with this stuff on the ground. As an author, I'm a journalist first. I'm not a practitioner or an engineer or a city planner. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who's just interested in the topic and spent probably too many years researching it and talking to people and trying to just dig up stories to understand it better. So I'm happy to offer everything that I can offer you. I'm sure that people on this will have really specific questions and I'll do my best to answer them, but ultimately, I hope to just offer a unique perspective on this issue. Can you hear me and everything?
Yep,
All good? Okay.
sounds good.
So this is a book about solutions. Over the Seawall is a book about solutions, but not necessarily solutions to the climate crisis. I like to say that we all know what we need to do to solve the climate crisis, which is to stop burning fossil fuels. This is a book about how we protect ourselves from the impacts that we can no longer avoid. And if there's kind of one lesson that I often say people should take away, it's that we're not going to solve this problem with the same thinking we used to cause it. So a little bit of background, I'm a journalist, obviously. I worked for years at a magazine called Yes, which is based out of Seattle. It's a progressive news site that really focuses on what they call solutions journalism. It's kind of all the rage now. And that meant that I was always reporting on and editing stories about solutions to some of the biggest problems that we're facing. I think that work is incredibly valuable, but I also started noticing around, as the years went by, that some of the solutions we were reporting on and kind of championing were not all they were cracked up to be, and some of them were even causing problems of their own down the road. I think that matters in a big way, right? Especially because of climate change. As we sit here today, there's people all over the world are spending huge amounts of time and money and human capital on solutions that might ultimately end up being doomed fixes. In my experience, that's usually because they're simple solutions to super complex problems, and they end up causing harm. The experts call this maladaptation. In the book, I try to use the phrase bad adaptation as if it's an improvement. So give a couple quick examples over this. This is a video that was taken not far from my house a couple years back, I think 2020. This is wildfire, of course, tearing down the foothills in Colorado. And I bring it up now because some of you may or may not be aware of the U.S. Forest Service 10 a.m. policy, which had been in place since the 1930s. It basically said that as soon as a wildfire was found in the western forest, it would need to be put out by 10 a.m. the next morning. The idea here, of course, was to stop the forest from burning, but it overlooked the simple fact that forests need to burn. The result now has been that forests in the West are denser than they used to be, with much more trees, also larger and more undergrowth beneath them. So they burn a lot harder when they do burn. It's a huge, huge problem. Another maladaptation we often talk about is air conditioners, as long as they're powered by fossil fuels, of course. If you're in Phoenix and you're cranking your AC to deal with the heat, you're burning fossil fuels that are ultimately adding to the same problem. So those are kind of maladaptation examples. Obviously, the one I get to big on the book deals with water and particularly seawalls and levees, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But first, kind of where I'm coming from on this. In a lot of ways, this book was my way of trying to make sense of something that I think had always bothered me while I was growing up. As you said, Joe, I was born in Pittsburgh, but I moved to Arizona when I was around 9. And I could never, even then, I think I was kind of unsettled by the whole scene playing out in the middle of the desert there. Like, I just could never understand why so many people would be moving to a place where something as basic as water was a really serious concern. Um, I used to think that we were all just really arrogant, that we couldn't imagine the worst case happening to us. And I still think that that's a big part of it. Um, but then I came across the story of what happened in Japan on March 11, 2011. That day, there was a 9.1 magnitude earthquake. It sent a tsunami barreling toward the coast. In some cities and towns along the northeastern coast in a region called Tohoku, the wave run-up height was 130 feet on land. Some people, something like 20,000 people would die. I think there's still 5,000 that are considered missing, though they haven't been seen in 11 years, 13 years. This is a temple in a town called Ishinomaki. This temple is a Doganin temple. It's about 950 years old. And when the wave came, something like 400 survivors from the earthquake fled uphill to this temple because it was the only thing that they could think to do to save themselves from what was happening. So the book opens up with a story of what happened in the Doganin Temple in that day in March in 2011. So I thought I would read a little bit from that first section before getting into some of the rest of the stuff. So Ishinomaki lost 3,173 souls on March 11. That was more than any other city in Japan, but not because it was uncommonly vulnerable. The port was well developed with breakwaters out in the bay. There's a concrete seawall already skirted the coast. Its flat face was pockmarked from decades of abrasive tides, and it rose straight up to about 20 feet in some places. It was no match for the wave that came in 2011, but then again, nothing was. No country was better prepared for a tsunami than Japan, and yet its leaders later admitted to being caught by surprise. Tens of thousands perished. I'm still wrapping my head around it, and I'm obviously not the only one. The disaster lured swarms of journalists, civil engineers, anthropologists, and even tourists who found stories of immense sorrow and unexpected hope. Fishermen who escaped by sailing into the wave, and daughters who were lost while searching for their parents. Forests wiped away, and towns rallying to rebuild. I found myself caught up in the story of a people harmed by the very efforts made to protect them. Climate change is often discussed as this monolithic crush bearing down on all of us at once, but what we experience is actually a series of familiar hazards, though more intense, more frequent, and certainly more erratic than we're used to. A tsunami might not be a climate-driven phenomenon, but it carries the hallmarks of one. It's got the breadth and the severity of harm. If Japan could fall victim to adaptations built to protect it from a hazard it has known for eons, then so could we all. Early in my reporting, I came across a story of a 52-year-old man who we'll call Kono-san. He was not home when the tsunami struck, but his wife was. Of the 2,500 residents in their coastal village, she was one of only 30 who perished. Between bouts of unhinged grief, Kono worried that her death had been embarrassing. Shameful might be a better word. The Japanese have a rich vocabulary to describe shades of guilt, and as I will learn, it's impossible to fully understand the complexity of survivors' feelings. An elder in the community and the head of a respected household, Kono felt ashamed that he had not saved his wife. He worried about how it must have looked to his neighbors. He also wondered why his wife had not led the way to safety, because he expected his family to set an example. Why had she remained while all around her alarms whirred and neighbors fled in panic? He blamed the seawalls, and the numbers back him up. In the months after the disaster, anthropologists from Oxford discovered that the death toll had actually been highest in communities where the government had recently invested in coastal protections like seawalls and levees, and where people had little experience with such waves. They reasoned that in many cases, the Hoku seawalls had been maladaptive. The investment in protective infrastructure had not only stimulated settlement in areas that were known to be vulnerable to flooding, but had also imparted this false sense of security that delayed victims like Kono-san's wife from fleeing. Subsequent research showed that despite Japan's long relationship with tsunamis, education campaigns, evacuation drills, coastal residents were as much as 60% more likely to stay put when they believed that a seawall rose above the height of an incoming wave. On March 11, 2011, initial reports predicted a 9.8-foot tsunami, and many towns were already protected by a 13-foot seawall. In Ishinomaki, the wave reached 22 feet tall. Miles north in the Taro district of a city called Miyako, people suffered the worst of this maladaptation. They had previously constructed a barrier so robust locals dubbed it the Great Wall of Japan. It was X-shaped to offer double protection and it was 35 feet high and stretched 1.5 miles of coastline. It was the largest wall of its time, and in 2011, people were so confident in its strength that they stood atop it recording images of the wave until the very moment they were washed away forever. At Taro, residents had put their faith in technology developed by one of the most advanced societies on Earth. 161 victims discovered too late that their trust had been misplaced. So it struck me that in the wake of such catastrophic failure, the city responded by building a new wall, 14 feet taller than the last wall, and yet somehow still 8 feet shorter than the 2011 wave. Seawalls undoubtedly saved untold lives and property in 2011, and since then, Japan has doubled down. Knowing that another tsunami is inevitable, the country has raised roads, elevated and relocated entire towns, planted coastal forests, and rethought its evacuation routes. But the centerpiece of reconstruction is an old idea, encasing the coast in concrete fortifications. Today, construction has nearly finished on some 400 miles of breakwaters, river levees, and seawalls as tall as 50 feet, at a total cost of something like, but probably way more than $255 billion. As the walls go up and the memory of Tohoku's devastation fades further into the past, people are rebuilding their homes and settling on raised lands in areas that were obliterated by the wave. But the new walls are so much mightier is encouraging, but I also discovered a growing sense of disillusion toward them. That manifested in heated community planning hearings, protests over the flippant use of concrete on natural coastlines, and the embarrassment that a 52-year-old man named Kono-san feels about his wife's final moments. I came to Tohoku to learn what had happened and to find out what, if anything, the past decade could teach the rest of us about how or how not to adapt to this increasingly unforgiving planet. All right. That's all I'll read, I think. But You can see that last video. Um, that was striking for me walking up that thing. It's just like you just kept walking and walking and walking. Um, so much of the coastline covered in concrete now. As someone who hasn't spent a lot of time in Japan previously, I found that really striking how much of this coastline is covered in concrete. Obviously, like I say in the book, the tsunamis are not climate problems, but this story, what happened on March 11, helped me understand that wonky, I think a pretty wonky idea of what maladaptation is. It's kind of like the whole story in a nutshell. And I think what's really important, one of the things that's really important is that the adaptations don't necessarily have to completely fail. They just have to have these negative unintended consequences. So obviously, seawalls did protect some people and save, property and lives in 2011, but it also had secondary impacts. When I got to Japan, I was mostly interested in what happened in 2011, but then I found the story of what happened afterward, and I found that to be far more fascinating. So this is a slide I don't typically show because it's obviously in Japanese. But since you're all mostly planners, you might find it kind of interesting. So this is a, a a page showing the plans for the reconstruction. You can see up in the middle there, there's a seawall that had been destroyed during the wave. On the left, you've got several designs for potential rebuilds. Notice the one on the bottom left is a straight wall. Most of the seawalls that were built in Japan prior to 2011 were kind of like that. They're without the underground support for the most part. And what actually happened was not so much that the wave pushed the walls inland. Actually, as the wave retreated, as it was sucked back out, as it did several times, um, the walls toppled toward the ocean, not toward the inland. And so the engineers, seismologists realized that in order to protect the people there, they were going to have to build much more robust walls. So they came up with these trapezoidal, seawall designs, like the one that I was walking up in the last slide. Obviously, these things take up a whole lot more of a footprint. Also, okay, so the red and blue lines in that thing off to the right. This is probably the most controversial aspect of what happened in Japan in the Reconstruction. They call it the L1 and L2 scheme. The blue line is the L1. L1 was a way of designating waves that were likely to come in the near next 100 or 200 years. So the idea was they would build walls, these trapezoidal walls that would protect against those types of waves. But everybody knew that because the cost is just the sheer cost, the amount of concrete it would take to really protect the coast from another 2011 size wave, which they designated L2, they just realized it was impossible to do that. It was economically unfeasible. And so they created a designation for L2 waves, which could not be stopped. And for those waves, the idea was they would move people back. You can see that darker orange section is actually raised land. This became a hugely controversial concept for locals who had to deal with the reconstruction. Many of them, when I got there, told me that the reconstruction after 2011 was like a second tsunami. Largely that was because these people, are living in coastal fishing towns, in tourist towns, and the idea of separating their communities from the ocean by this big wall of gray or white concrete, just really didn't sit very well for many of them. Um, tourists, hotel owners and tourist people wondered who would take the train or drive all the way up from Tohoku or from Tokyo or Osaka, right, just to stare at concrete. And I spoke with people in fishing communities whose families had fished for generations, who were used to going out and reading the waves every single day before they went out to catch tuna or whatever. And now they couldn't do that. This is another idea, you probably see some of these along Miami and stuff too, right? It's like kind of concrete jacks laid down there. Somewhat softer idea, but I found this guy trying to fish, and I was just wondering what was going through his head that moment, thinking about like, how he's going to meander his way out there, navigate his way out there to find those fish. A big part of the issue was the fact that the Japanese government set experts into all these towns, right? They were seismologists and earthquake experts and engineers from the big cities and the big universities whose job it was to go out to these small fishing and tourist communities, largely in rural parts of the country, in places in Tohoku, which is a region of Japan that was described to me as being like the American South in terms of kind of lack of economic investment. Um, and they were told to go into those communities and tell people that they were going to build these big walls and here's how we're going to protect you. And they completely bulldozed the local people's perspectives on, kind of what protection meant and what mattered to those people. So it became highly controversial. So kind of bringing this back to the climate change conversation, during those reconstruction talks, there was this phrase that was used over and over again. And excuse my horrendous Japanese, but it's sotegai. And sotegai was used by the media, politicians, and especially the people in TEPCO who who ran the Fukushima nuclear reactor. It basically translates to something like beyond expectation. And the idea, right, was that this wave that came was so grand, so huge that nobody could have ever imagined it. And if they could have imagined it, then there's no way they could have been prepared for it. So Sotegai was a way that, that these leaders were basically shirking their responsibility for efforts they might have taken, they should have taken to protect the coastline, people living there, and the nuclear facility from a wave. The idea was that the 2011 wave was unprecedented, but that's not true. One of the first characters you'll meet in my book is a researcher who explored Japan's this rich history of keeping records. They actually lined their walls with like old documents. And so he kind of dug through a lot of these old documents and discovered through painstaking research over years that there's a written history of waves like the 2011 wave happening about once every 400 years. Now that's a big deal because, the previous thought was that this wave, that size wave, comes once every 1,000 years. So we're speeding it up, almost by twice. If the idea is true that this wave comes every 400 years, that should have a significant impact on the way Japan planned for development and adaptation along that northern Tohoku coast. But it had been pretty much ignored. So for me, as a climate journalist, that phrase "Saute Gai" reminded me of another phrase I hear all the time, right? Which is this no analog future. That basically means that our baselines in the past don't relate to what's coming in this new world of climate change. And I think I get where that's coming from. It's obviously a lot of validity to it, but I think it's also not entirely true. The Earth has seen changes in temperature and sea level for millennia, and people have experienced a lot of them. And we have examples from eons of humans adapting to and living with a lot of these changes. We tend to celebrate the most successful adaptations, right? Those feats of engineering, the History Channel, it calls them modern marvels. But we often gloss over the failed attempts, and we overlook the systems behind those failures. That's what I think we can learn a lot from. That's why I wrote this book. So I traveled to Japan and Bangladesh, then back home to Arizona to learn those lessons. So this is me in Boulder. Yeah, like I said, show you kind of where Tohoku is across the Pacific. And you'll see all this green light. There we are. So that's Tohoku, that northeastern region of Japan. Those are all the places that I spent the most of my time reporting. Now we're going to Bangladesh. I was primarily in the southwestern corner. You can see the Sundarbans, that national forest down there, areas dealing with cyclones and sea level rise. And then we cruise back home to where I grew up in central Arizona, where the desert has been kind of developed into strip malls, urban sprawl, and in a big way, cotton and hay farms. So I won't go into too deep on all of these, but I just want to give you kind of the gloss over. This is a photo from Bangladesh, certainly is in Arizona. You can see here, obviously, just the huge level of poverty people are living in. What I'm standing on, taking this photo, that gray thing in front of you, the tan thing, is an embankment. It's a levee, an earthen embankment. And you can see how that house to the right was built on the outside of that embankment. That shows you how many times these embankments have been built. At one point, that house might have been on the inside, but now it's on the outside. They rebuilt the embankment on the other side of the house, which basically means that person living in that house, when storm surge comes or cyclone hits or the rains hit hard, they're going to be exceptionally vulnerable. So Bangladesh is the most foreign example that I really had to dive into. I went back a couple of times to try to understand it, still working on that. But I think it's one of the most complex and important examples in the book. It deals with these long histories of colonialism, and I try to expose how corruption in the modern foreign aid system and how people can make a buck off adaptation, how that really plays a role in increasing people's vulnerability. Sorry, I thought I had turned off the audio on this, but you can see these guys are building an embankment. This guy talked with the mud on his head right now. I spoke with him. He told me he was being paid $8 US a day to do this work. And he pointed off in the direction off to the let's see, that was the west to my right there. He said this is the fifth time that he had rebuilt that embankment in his lifetime. And he pointed way off into the west to the river, and there was like trees. You could see trees sticking up out of the water there. He said, when he first started, the embankment had been way out there. Now he's rebuilding it for the fifth time. I asked him what kind of faith he had that this would be the last time he had to rebuild that wall, and he just said, Inshallah. which basically means, like God willing, this will be the last time, but he didn't seem, I don't know. I certainly don't have a lot of faith in it. Worth noting, the US has a $35 billion budget for foreign investment and stuff like this. But only about 10% of that money ever makes it to these projects. So I mentioned this guy's, $8 a day. These are not highly skilled laborers, right? These are often people out of work farmers who are looking for jobs. 10% of the money that Western powers of the US have for this kind of work actually makes it to these projects. Most of it gets either lost to corruption, bureaucracy, or it gets swallowed up by what the Beltway bandits, the American and Western consultants who design these projects and eat up most of the money that's used for them. For me, here's another example of somebody living whose home is in the water on the wrong side of the embankment. For me, the Bangladesh example is really an example of what happens if we're not careful, how adaptation can be swallowed up and fall prey to the same forms of exploitative political capital and economic exploitation that kind of led us to where we are now with climate change. So I mentioned in Japan, one of the issues there was the seawalls delayed the evacuation. So they created this false sense of security. And that's what brought me back to Arizona. When I was reporting in Japan, I was afraid of being super rude to people by asking them to kind of relive like the worst moment they could ever imagine. But what I kept finding was that folks were actually happy for the opportunity to talk about it because the survivors were more scared that the lessons would be forgotten and that people would grow apathetic living behind their new walls the way they did behind the old ones. So for me, that's kind of what I see happening in Arizona, where I grew up. This is my argument in this book, is that the adaptations built in Arizona have made it so that millions of people are moving into a place where they are basically in the path of a giant wave. They're just not recognizing it. I always knew I was going to write about the desert because I grew up there and because I think it's important if you're going to go around the world and tell everybody else how to live, you should be willing to hold the mirror to yourself. The story in Arizona, right, is for 100 years, white settlers have tried to remake the desert as a garden. And that meant ultimately their plans, grew to, bringing water to the middle of the desert. This is my drawing of the Central Arizona Project Canal, which you can see running through the middle of it. After generations of building dams and sucking the groundwater dry, Arizonans fell back on what they do now, which is pumping Colorado River water, about 344 miles or so, some of it an incline elevation from the Colorado River in the border of California all the way down to south of Tucson. So I spent a lot of time with farmers, especially because they're the ones who are feeling the impacts of this the most. They would now rely on the Central Arizona Project Canal that brings the water from the Colorado River, but because of climate change and histories of overuse, they're finding that they are up a river without a paddle. Some of them have been cut off from water for the first time. This is one of those guys. His name is Jace. He's 35 years old. He's got a five generation old farm, and just discovered he was going to have his first son when I was interviewing him, who he would really like to continue the farming tradition there. But he also discovered that he's going to be the first among the first few hundred farmers in Arizona who are going to be losing access to the Colorado River, which means they're going to go back to pumping groundwater. The story there is that they had pumped the groundwater nearly dry. They were forced to go get on the river. Now they've stuck the river almost dry. Now they're forced to go back to the groundwater. Meanwhile, the state continues to grow. When I asked Jace, what he needs to stay in business and make sure that his son has a farm to inherit, he said, we need to build a pipeline to the Mississippi River. So that idea has been floating for a long time, building a pipeline to Mississippi. There's also ideas of building a pipeline to Pacific Northwest, the Columbia River, floating icebergs down the Pacific coast. A lot of these ideas are considered to be harebrained, wild, crazy ideas that'll never happen. But then again, the Central Arizona Project Canal that carries water from the Colorado River was once considered a madman's dream, and things got bad enough that it actually happened. So my idea in this book, one of the ideas is that we're going to be facing huge challenges that are going to make even the most ridiculous, insane ideas seem feasible or even necessary. And we need to think long term about what that's going to mean for people down the road, especially generations to come. So here I am in Bangladesh. Kids there were always really interested to see what a white guy doing with a notebook was up to. You can see in the background off to the right, out in the haze, that's the Matrix coal-fired power plant. Bangladesh, of course, one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, is also building some of its largest coal-fired power plants to date right now. In fact, this one just came online, I think at the end of last year, and it's not the only one. Another one's coming off over another part of the country. That's kind of crazy. But again, here, the crazy idea for adaptation is that people are poor, they need money. Money requires development and energy, so they're gonna burn coal to build factories, create jobs, and hopefully get people an opportunity to get out of poverty and protect themselves from climate change. To me, that seems like a really short-sighted idea, just about as short-sighted as building a pipeline to the Mississippi River. It was here in Bangladesh that I came across a thread that I think really carried me throughout the book. And it was one of my earliest sources that I met on one of my first trips there, who was a man named Delusion, who asked me, who are we adapting for? When I started writing this book, I was super angry just about the lack of effort, lack of action that was being taken on climate change, and the short-sighted decisions that we were making for adaptation. Then partway through writing the book, I discovered I was going to have a kid, and my son was ultimately born the week I was finishing the copy edits on this book. And that realization really changed the way I looked at this project and climate change adaptation generally. I think it made it a lot harder to be cynical when you know you've got a son coming into the world. I really started to think about what the Lieutenant had said. Who are we adapting for? He was saying, kind of looking at it in two different ways. If we adapt for the current generation today, then we should be building coal plants and hard levees to control the rivers of the Ganges Delta. We should be building pipelines to the Mississippi, and we should be building even taller seawalls around the coast of Japan. Because that might help people today make some money. It'll certainly help the companies that profit off of the construction of that infrastructure. But it's going to saddle the next generation with huge costs of maintenance and repair, and ultimately a lack of choices, because we'll have we'll kind of lock them into this particular future. We said if we're really adapting for the next generation, we need to be considering other ideas, what people today refer to like natural solutions and softer solutions. And I think that's for me is a really powerful way to look at it. So I was thinking about these kids in the future they have to inherit, and I keep coming back to that question: who are we adapting for? I think I'll kind of leave it there. I know there's probably lots of questions. This book is full of stories, tons of information. I try to keep it to really talking about the people who have to live with this infrastructure to make some of this stuff palatable and not just super dense, boring litany of numbers. But I'm happy to share more of my experiences and tell you more stories and answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Stephen. Those are some really powerful and important stories, and I appreciate you sharing them with us. Throughout the presentation, we've been assembling questions from the audience. As a reminder, you can continue submitting questions throughout the discussion, and we will get to as many of them as we can before 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So Stephen, if you could turn your camera on so people can see you, that would be great.
Hi.
And hi.
I'm a real live human.
I will ask our first question. How can seawalls be redesigned to be more sustainable and to incorporate natural systems that might be more effective?
Cool. That's obviously a really important question. There's a few aspects of it. I think first, the sustainability thing is interesting because there's been more and more talk today. I get into it a little bit in the book, but about the impact of concrete, right? It's kind of troubling, I think, a little counterintuitive. One of our reactions to climate change is to use so much concrete, whether it's building canals or levees or seawalls or whatever. Obviously, concrete has a huge environmental impact, right? I think the stat last I looked was that if the concrete industry itself was a country, it would be the world's third most greenhouse gas emitting country. So that's huge. So there's a lot of work being done. I live in Colorado now, and there's cement companies all around me, and some of them are here. I've seen others in New Mexico and in California as well. But there's a lot of work being done to try to make the concrete itself actually, sequester carbon, either capturing the carbon that's emitted during the production of concrete and actually putting it back into the cycle of creating the cement, the concrete that ends up being used on some of these projects. So you might be able to think about that as a way of making like seawalls, if you're talking about a concrete seawall being more sustainable. I still think that's super problematic. To me, that's even a band-aid solution, right? Because yeah, we can maybe sequester carbon in concrete, but we're still never going to, sequester all the carbon that's produced by making concrete for these projects. And so for me, it's like we're slapping a band-aid on this issue. Um, in Japan, I came across one group that was building what they called the Camellia Wall, and their town was kind of known for its camellias, these beautiful plants that flowered. And what they were doing, they argued with the government for years to get this to happen. This is a big issue there. Is the government had a very set idea of how they wanted to handle the reconstruction after 2011. Basically, it was the same idea along the entire coast, like the 400 some miles, like everybody who had been affected, right? The idea was just build seawalls. And these people did not want a seawall in their community. It was a very small community. They didn't feel they needed one. They had lived there for generations without a seawall. The government forced it on them. And what they ended up doing was building the seawall with these concrete blocks that had holes in them. And they filled the holes with soil, and they planted camellias and other plants in those holes. And so they created, like a green seawall, I guess you could say. And the thing blooms, and it looks a lot better than a big piece of concrete. I'm not sure that's really sustainable to that part of that question, but it is, I think, interesting. It's certainly a way of doing it. As much as I resist the idea of hard gray infrastructure in this book, ultimately I'm aware that that's going to be a crucial part of what we do moving forward to protect ourselves from climate change, sea level rise, and other issues, right? So if we can find ways to make it fit into people's lives better, I think that can be a really powerful thing to do. I hope that's somewhat of an answer.
Yes, thank you. Um, we've talked a lot about, building infrastructure and walls and even green infrastructure. Do you have any idea where all the funding for those projects may come from to prepare for and repair coastal infrastructures as the threat of disasters increase?
So that's an incredibly important question, obviously. It's going to vary by place and country by country. I think I'm not even going to try to answer like where that money's actually going to come from, because obviously that's going to depend on where we're talking about,
Right.
What country we're talking about. But I think asking that question is incredibly important, and I'll tell you what, because something I discovered in the process of reporting this. So in Japan, you go out to dinner, and there's one person at the table who obviously makes more money than everybody else, and they end up ordering for the whole table because they know the restaurant. They order the most expensive bottle of wine and all the best food, and then the check comes, and the question is, who's going to get the check, right? Well, the rest of us sitting at that table kind of allow that person to do all the ordering because we accept that they're probably going to pick up the bill. That's what happened in Japan. When the national government came in, the assumption was that they were going to pay for everything. They were going to pay for the reconstruction after the 2011 wave. And that gave them the ability then to make all the decisions because they were the one picking up the bill. That was a real sore spot for local communities there. And it raised some questions afterward. I mean, the fact of the matter is that how could these places, these smaller towns and cities, even begin to cover the bill for their own reconstruction? The reality is they probably couldn't. And that has to do in a large way because of um, the history that had happened there. I mentioned Tohoku being an economically depressed area to begin with. It had been aging out for years already. So the population was older. The tax base had been dwindling and aging. People weren't, there was not as many jobs. The concrete industry, which is one of the biggest employers in the region, had kind of fallen off. And so that's why they were definitely invested in getting seawall projects in the pipeline. But there's questions about, who should cover the costs, and if the local communities were the ones covering the costs in some way on their own steam, then maybe they would have had more to say about the decisions that were made for them. In Bangladesh, I found it was really fascinating. Most of that work being funded there is by foreign banks, foreign powers like U.S. Bank, U.S. Aid, Japan Bank, the World Bank, especially French government. And I didn't really talk about it much, but the book goes into depth on the hydrology of the Ganges Delta and the embankments, the levees that were built there, and the impact that they've had on the people living there, right? And I can talk more about that if anyone's interested, but the idea that was put in place there that is so problematic was not a local idea. It was a foreign idea that came from the Dutch, this polder system. It was a Dutch idea, and it was brought to the Bengal by an American back in the 1950s. Um, and they were the ones funding it. The US was the ones funding it, and these foreign banks were the ones funding it. And so they were the ones who then were able to determine what projects were going to be implemented here. And so they went with this foreign idea that turned out to be hugely problematic to the region. These polders, the embankments. Um, I mentioned the slides, it's also worth noting today that the foreign money that's put in these projects doesn't even get to the people, right? So much of it, a fraction of it, less than 10% of it actually ends up in these projects. The other thing that's really important about the money side of this stuff is not just who's going to pay for the initial construction, but who's going to pay for the maintenance, right? Because, seawalls and, concrete's going to last 50, 100 years if you're lucky, especially as sea levels continue to rise. I mean, you probably find yourself having to rebuild these seawalls in the very near future, or at least add to them. In Bangladesh, these earthen embankments are crumbling constantly. You saw the people who were building them, right? The guy said it was the fifth time he had done that. It's like someone's gonna have to pay for this maintenance. The World Bank funds these projects, but does not include any money for maintenance. That's super common. The global powers, the global banks like to say they're solving these problems with these solutions, but they don't actually stick around long enough or put any money in the contracts for the long-term viability of those projects, and it leaves locals to have to to cover the bill for it down the road. And you can see, locals in that video I showed you, the guy building the embankment in Bangladesh, there's a guy making what did I say, $8 a day. I mean, in a village where people are already devastated by that, what are the odds that they have the money to be repairing these things and paying for it? So they're locked in this continuing cycle of poverty because of that.
Right. In your travels and in your research, have you found any potential options for adapting, for lack of a better word, existing seawalls in urban environments? How do we deal when we've already built walls that may or may not be effective? Um, are there solutions or ideas for what to do with those?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I was just up giving a talk in Seattle. I spent, like I said, I worked for Yes Magazine, which is based in Seattle, and I was there for about a decade. Um, and in the Puget Sound now, there is a big push to remove seawalls and bulkheads that were built all on the Puget Sound. They had been built, I think, mostly around the 50s, 60s, 70s, as people started really developing the coastline all up and down the Puget Sound. And now locals are recognizing the impacts that those walls have had on the local ecosystems, especially. Um, like one of the impacts, right, is that the Puget Sound is obviously very important to salmon migrations, which are very important to the local native people there, like the Duwamish tribe and others. And seawalls have kind of destroyed a lot of the breeding habitat for fish like salmon. And so the salmon population has kerplunked.
Mhm.
Um, and now this is pushed to remove these bulwarks and seawalls. And there's a pretty cool example I talk about in the book, actually, but only briefly. But it's at the Olympic Sculpture Park in downtown Seattle, so right in the heart of the city, where there had been a big ass wall, and they pulled it down and have turned it into more of a rocky beach with some concrete further back. And that work has, I talk about in the book as an example of you can see the impact of seawalls by seeing what happened when that wall was taken away, because they've seen a pretty amazing resurgence of tidal life and habitat and a rebound in salmon populations, probably because of that. Just from removing that section of wall. So they're doing that now all along the Puget Sound. And that's, it's worth keeping in mind, because as we consider the option of maybe building more seawalls, you can see the places where they've done it are now spending a whole bunch of money to get rid of them. That's something we should be, thinking long term about. And in California, there's also, I think, two lawsuits, maybe more in California, having to do with people, wealthy folks who have built seawalls on their property. And those walls are now causing, a seawall does not absorb the impact, does not absorb the energy of a wave. It just dissipates the energy onto somebody else. So when a wealthy person builds a seawall in their backyard, it pushes the energy of that wave onto somebody else downstream. And eventually it's going to get to somebody who doesn't have the money to build a seawall. And so it becomes super problematic and forces erosion into another part of the beach. Um, so there's, California has regulations against the construction of personal seawalls. Some people just do it anyway, try to get around it. And I think there's several ongoing lawsuits about this. And they might have a huge impact. This way those come out will have a huge impact on what the state decides to do in terms of a larger scheme, a larger plan for seawalls in the future. That's worth keeping an eye on.
Right. Yeah, I have done some work in Maryland. I used to work for the Port of Baltimore, and we had those discussions about if we build a wall to protect our terminal infrastructure and there's a storm surge, where is that water going to go? And I think that's an important question that we have to ask ourselves as we start designing hard infrastructure or even natural solutions and natural infrastructure. Where is the water going to go?
Absolutely. Um, Real quick, I think also there's a question of where the water goes behind the wall. I know that was
Mhm.
one of the biggest issues with the proposals for the projects along in New York City. There have been one of the proposals is to build a wall across Hudson Bay that would have a gate so you could open it. I've seen walls like that in Japan also.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the big complaints is that these walls would cause water to back up behind the seawall when you got a lot of flooding. That's already a problem there, especially for lower income residents in certain low-lying parts of the island and Long Island. And so it's easy, I think, sometimes to focus on what's happening on the other side of the wall, where the wave is coming, where sea level is happening, and forget about how it's going to impact people on the inside of the wall.
Right. So a lot of us on the webinar are planners and we work with engineering firms and consultants all the time. Do you have any takeaways or advice for how we as planners can discuss these issues with engineers and other colleagues to sort of raise these issues and also collectively aim for solutions?
Yeah. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not a planner.
Right.
I don't necessarily envy you guys. I mean, it's much easier to be a journalist and just go around and see what everyone's doing wrong and point a finger than it is to actually have to be making these decisions and fielding the issues on the ground. So I appreciate the work. From what I've learned, in my specific experience, um, I guess maybe it sounds corny and cheap as an answer, but the reality was getting local people involved in those discussions as soon as possible. Um, I think this question was about how we talk to the engineers who are designing the seawalls. My answer would that be to tell the engineers to go talk to the people who are going to have to live behind the seawalls
Right.
as soon in the process as you possibly can. Japan had this goal of building all the seawalls within 10 years. They wanted to actually finish reconstruction within 10 years. They just kind of set that goal. I think I know actually, because I spoke with people high up in the government about it. Um, they needed to do something, like anything at some point. I mean, 20,000 people were killed in basically a day. Um, Whole communities were completely wiped off the map. You could just never, I cannot even begin to fathom the level of devastation there.
Mhm.
So obviously something had to be done. And the government decided pretty quick they were going to build these walls, they were going to pay for it themselves, that the national government was going to pay for it, they were going to make the decisions, and they were going to get it done within 10 years. Part of getting it done within 10 years, of course, means not having a community council meeting or community hearing, on every single decision that needs to get made and letting every Joe Blow weigh in on every little aspect of it, right? That's obviously going to take forever. So they just kind of pushed forward with it. But the reality was that caught up with them. And within
Mhm.
the actual reconstruction dragged out for years and years and years. Um, it didn't go as smoothly as it was hoped to. It came in way over budget. And I mean, I tell stories in the book about communities where they had fought tooth and nail to get the wall that was ultimately built to be just below eye level, so that when somebody walking along the main street, the shoreline, which used to be a really happening harbor.
Mhm.
Uh, they could see the ocean and see the beautiful scenery right in this big valley. The people wanted to keep the wall just beneath that. And one of those stories that I tell in the book, they fought for years to have that happen. And at the end of it, well, let's just say it didn't quite work out as they had hoped it would. And I think it might have been different if the government had gotten local people involvement at the very beginning to understand what the people want, really. What are they most afraid of?
Right.
Um, what parts of their town are they willing to sacrifice? Because I found that was something that people were actually willing to accept. They said people told me they live in the coast of Japan. They've been dealing with tsunami their entire existence for long before
Mhm.
they've been around. Um, some people told me they built their homes purposefully out of materials that they could resource and rebuild after being knocked down for a reason. Um, that was something that was so hard for me to wrap my head around. Obviously, it's an extreme example as as an American going to Japan, but I think as an engineer who's caught up in the numbers and the daily facts of this stuff, it's also worth considering the way people on the ground are going to see this stuff and what they're really willing to deal with.
Right. That sort of gets to the infrastructure that's been built around New York City, where they're building parks that are designed to flood so that whatever is built there is designed to withstand it and to be able to be rebuilt fairly quickly or replanted fairly quickly. So that, I think that goes beyond Japan.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
we have a similar question about, how to get people involved. Your stories all involve people and communities, obviously, who feel deeply connected to their place.
Hmm.
Um, and that, and when that place is at risk, are there, um, are there approaches that you would suggest or you have seen that have worked to sort of keep the spirit of the place, but also provide some protection?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, let's see. Well, I mean, I'll go. So that's a really interesting question. There's so many ways I can answer it. So the one that's running through my mind right now, but I'm not sure I want to get into it too deeply because I feel like there's a lot of people on this call who are going to say whatever, man. Um, but that is um, and one of the towns that was hit the hardest in Japan, Rikuzen Takata, is like kind of a famous shot. I mean, that place is basically obliterated because it's a kind of a flat, it's a flat plain where people lived on in a narrow valley. So when the wave came in, it rose pretty high and it took out like everything. It was all low-lying flat land. Um, Somebody who lives there now is working on a line of cherry trees um, that is going to run the length of like along the length of the shore up as high as the wave came, the run up height of the wave on the day of 2011. So the idea is he's using community involvement to plant all these trees in this long line. And every spring, actually right around this time of year, those trees will blossom in bright red and white and pink, And he hopes that people will look up at that line of trees and say to themselves, that's as high as the wave came in 2011. And it'll make them think about where they're building and where they are. And the reason I say I kind of hesitate to tell that is because I recognize that it's not exactly the most, feasible for like especially as an urban area like Baltimore or something. But it's something that gives people their pride and their community because he wants them to think about the locals to think about, see those trees and think, wow, that's beautiful. Like, why is that there? Oh, wait, it's there because of this horrible disaster that happened all these years ago. And then
Mhm.
get to the conversation around adaptation and the conversation about risk and how we deal with risk through that lens, not just confronting them with the horrors of what happened, but actually confronting them with something more beautiful. And it harkens back to an older history that Japan has of erecting these rocks with inscriptions on them all along the coastline at the wave run-up height of previous waves. There's these beautiful kind of obelisks that rise up, and they have, sometimes they're painted, and they just have the words that say, in whatever year a wave came this high, it killed this many people, it devastated this town.
Mhm.
Um, those rocks are kind of hidden now; they've been grown over by moss and trees and things. So this guy Shomo Akamoto feels that this wall of sakura trees, of the cherry trees, will be a more long-standing impact. Thing I found fascinating about his work really is that somebody has to plant those trees. And so every year he goes out there with groups of people, old people, young people, survivors of the wave, people who have just moved to town, and they all get together and they volunteer to help plant these trees that show the high water mark. So that's a way of making the adaptation active instead of passive, rather than just people, the government building a thing, engineers building a thing, and everyone just living with it. Here's people building something that they are involved in, and they can share the stories in the process of actually building it. I think that's super powerful.
Yeah, that is. Thank you for that. Um, there's a lot of debate um, around these issues, especially in coastal areas or in floodplain areas along rivers about retreat
Hmm.
and how far should we A, stop construction of new infrastructure and buildings and homes in those areas, and how do we deal with the potential retreat? Um, it's an overwhelming question and it's an
Yeah.
overwhelming issue, but have you seen or heard these debates and have any thoughts that might enlighten folks about those those very like personal issues? Because, you know, American history bears this out. People love to live on the shore and
Yeah.
move closer to the ocean all the time. The fastest growing states are the southern states around the Gulf of Mexico. Um, and they're extremely vulnerable. So how do we as humans deal with that?
I think that's, they also like to live, people also like to live at the edge of beautiful forests or inside
Hmm.
beautiful forests, and I'm here in Longmont, Colorado, not too far from me, a fire burned through, an entire community of people. Um, and it's been incredibly interesting to see how that fire, the response to that fire, I think it was 1,000 structures that were destroyed, right? And afterward, well, in the immediacy, hotel prices and Airbnb prices skyrocketed, right? After 1,000 homes were destroyed, 1,000 structures were destroyed, hundreds of homes. Um, where are those people going to go? It happened on December 30th. So it was not a good time. Holidays and everything. Where were these people going to go? I think it's a real testament to how horrible our system can be, our economic system can be. That in the immediacy of that event, a lot of people who had an opportunity to house those people, those survivors, chose to jack up the prices. So I think that's really something that needs to be done in terms of talking about retreats. To think about the cost of the land and housing of where people are going to go immediately following a disaster. Now, the insurance companies don't want to pay out for the reconstruction in that area, and contractors. I was just talking to a contractor the other day who told me this in a way that he was like, quietly, I think, I don't know, proud is I think too hard, but like almost like, it was a great business move that he was increasing the cost of his services because of the number of people who needed to be rebuilding their homes after that wildfire. And the idea maybe was that that the insurance companies would just cover it, but I think that's pretty flimsy. But I do think we talk about managed retreat. We need to think about. I think it probably is a regulatory issue that addresses the affordability of where people are going to go. Um, in Japan, after the wave, some communities were forced to retreat. Government said, yes, we will rebuild your towns, but not where the wave hit. One challenge with that was that they pushed people back uphill, would not allow them to live down in the area that was inundated during the 2011 wave, but they also still built a seawall to block a further wave, a future wave. And a lot of local folks wondered, why are they building a seawall and forcing us to move? Now they've just destroyed the coastline and pushed us all back. Um, that was a challenge. I spoke with survivors there in an area called Sendai, especially, who watched their whole community dissipate as it got moved inland. That was, I think, for a couple of reasons. One was that young people left the town because they were wondering, what kind of work is going to be here for us in this new community. Um, and they wanted to live someplace where maybe this threat was no longer there. So I think about uh, um, resettling people in a different place. We need to be thinking about really strong quickly about what kind of economic opportunities are going to be in place for the people who are resettling. We especially need to keep young people and young families there. Otherwise, those communities will just hollow out. Um, and also the amount of time it takes for us to do it,
Right.
because you can't just build these things overnight. Japan put a lot of people in temporary housing. Some people are still living in temporary housing. They're essentially dormitories. Um, and some folks said they were going to stick around, they were going to stay there, but it took so many years for the place to get, for the new homes to get built, that they eventually gave up and moved on. So the speed of things, I think, is really super important. And obviously, you're probably saying, Stephen, how the hell are you supposed to include community involvement, figure out jobs for everybody, and find, like affordable housing for folks all immediately following a disaster quick enough that people don't leave the town before any stuff becomes available? And I have absolutely no idea how you would do that.
Right. Um, Reading through the questions, somebody had asked about climate migration, and I think that your story that you just told leads to that question about how do we address the issues of increased immigration and migration from poor, low-lying countries or extremely vulnerable countries um, to places where they see more opportunity. Have you come across any examples or ideas for how to humanely deal with those types of issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously Bangladesh is ground zero for climate migration. Millions of people on the move there, and millions of more expected to be. So the area that I was working in is very specific, both in its hydrology, its and geography, and its climate impacts. The southwest corner of Bangladesh, just north of the Sundarban, that big mangrove forest that's down there. Um, uh, there are cities in that region, and there is a new effort that's being championed by some of the country's kind of, I think, best thinkers on this issue. Call it climate friendly cities. It's worth looking into. Um, and I think in Bangladesh it's tough because of how difficult how much the government there struggles to really accomplish things. But um, it's thinking about cities that are already established that we can protect, finding ways to preemptively prepare for the coming migrants. Right
Mhm.
now, the problem is that everybody in Bangladesh who's coming out of that southwest region that's being especially hit by sea level rise, which is really exacerbated on a huge scale by the infrastructure that was built there by the Dutch and the Americans, which is what I talk about in the book. Um, those people are mostly going to Dhaka, the major, the mega city, which I think is what the world's third largest city, and it's most densely populated. Um, it is an unlivable place for most people. It's horrible air pollution, um, you know, uh, really difficult issues finding jobs there. Housing there is really stressed. Millions of people live in shanty towns that are unregulated, unpoliced, that they burn often. It's a really terrible situation, but there's just no other option for a lot of these people. And so there's an effort in Bangladesh called the Climate Friendly Cities Initiative to build cities to use smaller cities and make those cities interesting and attractive to climate migrants, to keep them from going to Dhaka, and to have them instead go to some of these smaller towns like Mongla or Kulna, or places
Mhm.
where I talk about a lot in the book. I think that's something that, personally, I think in the Arizona section of my book, I feel like my argument is a large part that we need to stop developing that region. Um, and that sounds crazy. And I'm obviously not asking that everybody in Phoenix just up and moves to a new city, but I do think it's
Right.
worth considering how we develop, where we invest our dollars for development in the future. And I think we can choose to invest our development dollars and move businesses and things into towns that will be easier to protect in the grand scheme. That means away from the coasts and out of the middle of the desert,
Mhm.
and make those places more attractive.
Right. I've often wondered why the desert of California is such a huge and important agricultural region when it started out as a desert. um, those kind of questions sort of pop up when we talk about these issues, especially when we get away from the coasts.
Can I read you a very short section of my book that addresses that?
Sure.
This comes from that guy Jace. I showed a photo of him earlier on. Um, but Jace was talking about that very issue. Stephen, please unmute.
It's needed.
Okay. So I'm not sure how much of that you just missed, but anyway, this is coming from a farmer named Jace, 30-something-year-old farmer. I asked him about, why farmers are growing things in the desert, um, which is one of the biggest complaints I get when I talk to especially people from the cities, like in Phoenix. Um, And he says, or I'll lead into what he says, but here we go. Okay, so it says, although it might not look like prime agricultural land to most people, Jace Miller watches the heat dance off the desert and recognizes power. He sees short winters, rare frosts, and 300 days of free plant fuel. When the Corn Belt is knee-deep in wind-blown snow, he's going back for a seventh harvest. He says, there's arguments that say we shouldn't be wasting water on farming in the desert environment. My rebuttal to that is, hey, we can grow not every crop in the US, but most of them more efficiently and more effectively because of our climate. We can grow alfalfa, cotton, Bermuda, Sudan, wheat, barley, sorghum, corn, potatoes, sugar beets. We're the winter lettuce capital of the world. We grow broccoli, sweet corn. The only thing we can't grow here is soybeans. Well, we can grow them. They grow badass. But when we combine them, they shatter and drop all over the ground. Jay spits into the narrow mouth of an empty Bud Light bottle and orders another round. He says, if I were supreme ruler of the world, there would be no one living in this goddamn state except ranchers and farmers. That was his answer to that question. And it's interesting because the truth is, with the amount of sun and the quality of the soil in Arizona, the only thing you have to control is water. And it's actually easy to control because you don't have to worry about huge storms flooding you most of the time. You just have to worry about how you get the water in. So from a farmer's perspective, it's actually some of the best place to be.
Well, and it's a matter of perspective too, right? Is farming with their very scientific irrigation methods that only use enough water to make the plants grow, is that somehow worse than building pools and fountains and things in cities and suburbs around the cities in the same area? It's all about perspective, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think that's a fundamental question we're going to have to consider with adaptation, right? When I say, who are we adapting for? Like whose perspective are we going to lean into most, I guess, and what matters to us?
Hey, I'm going to read our next question because it's a very good question and I don't want to paraphrase it and change its meaning.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Carl Hendrickson met with members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde here in Oregon, and they spoke about historic change of coastlines over the course of the last 10,000 years when their ancestors had lived there. Those people have generational knowledge of how to move with changing coastlines and still maintain community. I wonder if you've considered trying learning from Indigenous people who have adapted to a changing world in the past.
That's an awesome question. In fact, I actually have slides. Would it be okay if I showed a couple slides?
Sure.
This is something that I kind of cut the thing short, but I can. Let's see here. Let me go back to this. No, not that one. Do. Okay. So we're gonna go to. Come on now. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Jahin Shams. He's in Bangladeshi. When I found him, he looks all sweaty in this picture. He probably would hate that I show this photo of him. He was just playing cricket when I found him. And we had a long interview, so he was just coming off the cricket field. Anyway, but he is somebody who's been working to promote a way of living with the rivers in Southwest Bangladesh rather than trying to contain them. This is an idea that a lot of people there consider to be indigenous knowledge. Although that word, takes on different meanings because this idea has really evolved so much there's such a long history of colonialism in Bangladesh. It's hard to really like draw a hard line that says this is indigenous and this is not. But anyway, so he showed me how local rice farmers had modified what kind of an ancient practice in a way of undoing the damage that the imposed embankments have done. Now he calls this tidal river management. It's, like I said, modeled off this kind of indigenous way of living in the Delta. So these are some cool shots of the Delta to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. The green is vegetation, the red is development, which most of that I think is farm, and of course the blue is water. So you can see how many rivers there are, right? Bangladesh is cut up. It's a mud plain, a flat mud plain. I think the mud goes about 12 kilometers deep before you hit any kind of bedrock. You can think about how, if you're just shooting your garden hose through the mud in your garden and the way that hose breaks up the mud and pushes it around, that's what the Ganges and Brahmaputra and Padma rivers are doing, and the Ganges River Delta. They're kind of pushing that mud around and creating all these new rivers. There's anywhere from 300 to 900 some rivers in Bangladesh, depending on who you talk to. The idea now is that imposed way of managing this incredibly complex river system is to put up embankments all on the rivers to hold them in place and build essentially islands, create islands within which people live, islands within the rivers, surrounded by these embankments. These islands they call polders. The problem, though, has been that embanking the rivers, just like the Mississippi, has caused the rivers to fill up with sediment because there's an enormous amount of sediment coming out of the Himalayan mountain range, which is what feeds this system, this river system. So what's happening now, what's been happening for decades, is that um, the sediment is building up inside the rivers because for a long time, forever, the rivers were allowed to overflow their banks and flood. And that's how all that 12 kilometers of mud got to be in Bangladesh, right? The rivers would flood and spill that sediment outside their banks. Now that the rivers are being contained by embankments, the sediment is building up inside the waterways. It's causing the water level inside the rivers to rise, while the land inside the polders is actually sinking because the land is compacting. The mud is compacting over time. It's like settling rather. So you can be walking along one of the embankments in Bangladesh. On your right will be the water, and on your left will be a community of people living on dry land, and the water will be 10 feet higher than the dry land, just a few feet from the top of the embankment. And so you know that on a bad tide or a storm surge or a cyclone or something, it's going to spill and everyone's going to be screwed. So anyway, there's this idea called tidal river management, and this is kind of my drawing of it. But the idea is to try to harness the sediment that used to be coming, that the rivers used to spill across their banks, and to rather than let it spill across everywhere, all across the delta where millions of people are living, to have it spill into these kind of centralized, concentrated areas. They're called basins, tidal river management basins, or a TRM basin. So the idea here of this is, I'll simplify. I could talk about this for days, but the idea is that the river comes down, or actually comes upstream in this case, with the tide. It's carrying a huge sediment load. When the river reaches its highest point in the tide, it sets for a second, just kind of like it's like water in a glass that has a cup of tea, with sugar in it. As the water, you stir the water, and then the water slows, and eventually, as the water comes to that point where it stops moving, the sugar all settles out of the water and it falls. Same idea with this river. The river comes upstream in this case. It hits that cross dam. It gets forced through the canal into the tidal river basin, and that's where the tide reaches its highest point, and the water stops for a second, and all that sediment settles out of the river and into the sediment basin. Then the river retreats back with the tide. It slips out toward the bay, and it sucks actually with a lot of force as it does that. It actually naturally dredges the river and sucks more sediment out toward the bay naturally. So this idea is building off of a way that people lived in land for millennia, where they lived with the seasons, with floods. Farmers here used to allow the rivers to flood naturally because they recognized that the flooding rivers brought new fresh fertilizer and sediment and actually built up the land that they were living on. Problem now, of course, the place is so densely populated, you can't let it happen everywhere. So the idea here is to break the embankments in certain places, create these canals and basins, and push people, farmers mostly, off the land in certain areas, allow the land to build up by allowing the water to spill in there and dump its sediment, and then once that tidal river basement is filled, allowing the farmers to come back in and moving that tidal river basement down somewhere else. I don't know if I've done a great job of explaining that, but that's generally the idea here. And you see here's one of those rivers. But yeah, that's an old indigenous knowledge way of living with the river. I mean, Bangladeshis, kind of like the Inuit, have a whole bunch of different words in Bangla for flooding, like the Inuit have all those words for snow. It's not just good floods or bad floods, or even just the way we look at floods as bad. Like they have all these different words for different types of floods at different times of year, and they learn over a long time to live with those things. And there's ways of doing it. So that TRM is an idea that's catching some attention nationally, internationally, even, especially among academics who are kind of looking into this. The question is, how do you monetize it? How do you make it attractive to donors who would have to pay those farmers to move off their land? And how do you get the government to get interested in this idea? So there's a very long answer to that question.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. There's another question. It sort of goes to sort of learning from the Netherlands example. After Katrina, the folks from the Netherlands went to New Orleans to provide advice. And the questioner notes that in order to follow the sort of Dutch example, they would need higher densities and targeted treatments, higher taxes to pay for the expensive improvements, and more focus on community needs over individual property rights.
Mm.
In the United States, where we're a politically divisive area, is there any advice you could give or examples of how to talk about these issues in a way that sort of can break through some of those issues? I know that's a tough question.
That's a super tough question. This is when I come back to like, I don't envy you guys. Uh, and one thing that comes to mind is that, I guess the phrase like don't throw good money after bad. I think that's really something that we're going to be dealing with in the long term here with climate change and adaptation. We're going to be tempted to do these short fixes like build levees the way we've been building levees or seawalls the way we've been doing that, and to allow us to continue to settle or to protect the homes that we have on the coastline or next to a fire prone desert or forest or something. Um, it's throwing good money after bad, in my experience, because what's going to end up happening, right, is we're going to have to rebuild all those communities over and over again. And eventually we're going to get to the place as sea levels continue to rise, as cyclones continue to get more destructive, where we're just going to have to move. And we're going to wonder why we didn't move when it was easier. It's never going to be easy. This is never going to be something that we do that's simple and quick. We're talking here about transformative adaptation, which goes beyond the idea of just building a piece of infrastructure to protect ourselves. It's rethinking the way that we live in this environment. The Dutch, this is actually really complicated. The Dutch have a way of living in their environment that they figured out over many, many centuries of doing it. The Americans, white settler Americans have been living on this continent for only a few hundred years. We have so little experience in this environment, and yet we're totally set in our ways of how we should be living here. I think what's going to happen is we're going to find that it's incredibly expensive to continue our current lifestyle, and eventually we're going to be forced into doing something else and really rethinking not just the way we build seawalls or something, but the whole way that we live, and thinking less individualistically, and more okay with density. We don't all need our yards in a big home or something on a big piece of property. I think we're going to be forced into that realization. And I think people in Hawaii maybe are going to be we can think about how we rebuild that area that just burned. I'm of the mindset that if something gets washed away or burned over, we should really think seriously about whether we want to rebuild in that area at all, or if we want to take the opportunity, because there will never be another easier opportunity to move out of it. That's what happened in Japan. I mean, the communities that were devastated there were forced to move out of it, and moving prior to that devastation was unthinkable, right? I mean, just like it is for us today to move out of some of these places. But after the wave came, it seemed like maybe that made the most sense, and it was certainly the easiest time to do that. One other thing I'll say about the Dutch. The Dutch have gone around the world telling everybody that they know how to manage water, that they're the ones who know how to do it. The Dutch are the reason that the Bay of Bengal is such a shit show. They have no idea how to manage water in the type of water that comes through the Bay of Bengal, or for that matter, the type of water that's coming through Mississippi and Louisiana. Let's say they have no idea. Obviously, there are experts there. Look at this now, but they're basing a lot of that conversation around their ideas of the polder system, which was developed on their land, which is dealing with coastal inundation, not heavy sediment load river systems. The reason that the Bengal is in the dire straits that it's in is because they've adopted this way of managing water that does not work for them. And it's really important, I think, for adaptation. We so desperately want these kind of one and done, plug and play solutions. Like the Dutch have a great way of managing water. Let's just stick it all over the world, right? Anywhere someone's dealing with flooding. That's problematic. We need solutions that exist in the places that arise from the places where they're going to be implemented. That's super important.
Right. I couldn't agree more. Um, this is sort of a related question. A lot of the projects that we've talked about today are massive single solution infrastructure projects that feel a little bit like we're putting all our eggs in one basket. Have you
Hmm.
seen any incremental projects, ideas that try something and then build upon lessons and have progressive adaptation built in? So try something, if it doesn't work, alter it, and then um, I guess keep trying.
Yeah, I mean, I can go a couple of different ways. I guess if I take it to Arizona, um, you can see the progression of trying things, having them not work, and then taking it one step farther. So I think it's really important. I think what this person's asking about is different than this, but I'll just say anyway, the idea of just we build a dam, we need more water, let's build another dam, a bigger dam. We're not sucking enough, the groundwater is running out, let's go get water from the river. You could look at that as each of those as being an adaptation. That's the way I look at the book. Each of those steps, of progressive steps along this pathway. But they're steps in a direction that's also always thinking about augmentation, always thinking about how to get more and more and more, and always using kind of the same mindset. Um, as much as I've kind of ragged on so far the Japanese and the way that they've reacted to the 2011, I think there are really good examples there. I talk about the sakura line, the trees. Obviously, that's a soft thing. Um, but I showed you that Japanese page, right, with the different seawall designs and the L2 and the L1 seawall heights. Um, so what they're doing there is actually a multi-tiered approach. In some places, they're implementing this better than others. The Sendai Plain is a particularly good example if you want to look at, especially an area that might be a little bit more um, of a illustration for Maryland, because it's kind of a broader, flatter floodplain area rather than like these very narrow valleys where a lot of northern Japan is. But anyway, so in Japan, in the Sendai Plain in Tohoku in Japan, they have not just a seawall, but they've also planted a big forest along the coastline. They've turned some of it into the Sanriku National Forest, which has now become a tourist attraction. And it's a way of, capitalizing on like the natural splendor and the beauty of the region, but also it's a way of keeping people from developing in those areas. They've also dug a canal that unearths an old canal that was dug hundreds of years ago by Date Masanuma, an old like shogun. Um, and that canal is an attempt to kind of siphon some of the water off that might eventually hit a seawall further inland from the coast. So as a wave already comes, if it gets past the forest, it gets past the seawall, it hits this canal, and then some of that will hopefully dissipate. They've also elevated roads in some places and turned some of the roadways into seawalls in a way, further more inland kind of a barrier to some of the ways. So this might all sound, I don't know how it sounds to you, but I think for Japanese people, this is a lot of the stuff was pretty mind blowing because the idea for so long had just been just build a concrete seawall. And now they're talking about a multi-tiered approach. So I think there is a lot of interesting things to be said about that kind of incremental changes like you're saying. There are ways to do it. And I think that to me is a much more of a solution moving forward for all of us is to think about things in terms of an adaptive solution. Our solution should be malleable. They should be adaptive themselves. They shouldn't just be like something that we decide like a dam, like the Hoover Dam that we built, and now it's done, and now we don't have to think about water anymore. We should be thinking about things that we can actually change down the road that we can manipulate as our situation around us changes.
Right. And it reminds me of a quote that I learned when I was studying climate change, which is the the past no longer predicts what will happen in the future. And change is happening so quickly that we have to be more adaptive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that no analog future thing. Yeah, we
Yeah.
don't. Yep.
We're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay.
Are there any environmental sustainability solutions that you come across that address some of the water scarcity and wildfire concerns in the western part of the US?
Um, yeah, there's lots. I think so water, yeah, well, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Wildfire and water scarcity can be they're obviously related, but they're also often kind of, I think, experienced in different ways. Um, my experience, especially in Arizona, right, the water scarcity affects the farmers first. Um, the reason being that farmers there use about 80% of the water that comes out of the Colorado River system. Like three-quarters of the water in the entire state of Arizona goes to farming. A lot of that farming is cotton and alfalfa, which is super water intensive. Um, so kind of a more environmentally friendly way of managing that water. It's something that we obviously need. I think I'm not sure I'm gonna do a great job of answering this question because it's a heavy one, but there are people there who say the thing we should do is just get rid of the farmers, right? Just get rid of the agriculture. And I let you hear what Jace Miller, that farmer, had to say about that, about how it's actually a really good place to grow things. But it does really matter, like what we're growing there. Um, I've been doing some reporting more recently on things like crop insurance. Crop insurance is, like you can apply this to housing as well. It incentivizes people to take risks that they might not otherwise take, right? Farmers continue to plant water thirsty crops like cotton in the middle of the Arizona desert, even though year after year those crops get ravaged by the sun and lack of water, because they know that the federal government, by way of the US taxpayer, is going to be covering their losses. That disincentivizes disincentivizes them from adapting, from trying out different crops. So I think, you know, straightforward and level-headed regulation and a change to our crop insurance system is crucial. That would free up a lot of water in the Arizona desert and California too, obviously, right? If we could get water from the farmers without getting rid of the farmers, it'd be wonderful. Um, the other thing there is, like, you got to think about markets. Um, the farmers don't grow cotton and alfalfa in Arizona because they just like it. They grow it because somebody buys it. Saudi Arabia buys it, China buys it, Japan buys it. Um, and the US buyers also buy it. They ask for less money. So I think that's something else. We need to think about the incentives. I think I mentioned this before a little bit with where we develop, incentivizing people to make decisions that will be ultimately environmentally friendly. That's what we need to be doing. I guess the only way this country ever seems to move on anything, right, is if the dollar forces it to. Um, in Arizona right now, not only are we having farmers paying farmers for failed crops and buying water thirsty crops from them, but we're also allowing big companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook to build huge data centers in the middle of the desert. These data centers are incredibly energy intensive and water intensive, and yet we allow them to move in there because of the potential economic benefits for the region. Now, that's super problematic. I saw a bill recently introduced in New Zealand, and I haven't checked in the last few weeks to see what happened with it, but it was a bill that would ban development in areas that were known to be climate vulnerable. And I think that's a really smart way of moving forward. Um, just kind of thinking about what we incentivize where, and incentivizing farmers to grow less water intensive crops, to grow native crops, and incentivizing industries in the desert that don't use a ton of water and energy. We can still have people there, we can still have industries there, but we should think really carefully about which ones we do. I mean, last thing I'll say on that is, my book in the Arizona section, Over the Seawall, opens with a person who's building a surf park in Mesa, Arizona, in the outskirts of Phoenix, in the middle of the sprawl. Um, and try to kind of think about, why he thinks Mesa is a good place to be building a surf park in 2024.
Thank you very much. This has been a really great conversation. I usually end giving the speakers a chance to give us any last remarks that you might have wanted to um, have been asked about but weren't. And if you could give us just some idea about how you stay optimistic in the face of these incredibly large issues.
I'm going to skip the first part because I feel like I've been talking too much as it is. Uh, but how was I optimistic? Like I said, my son was born, and he'll be a year next month. And I say optimistic honestly because I don't have any other choice now. I cannot imagine a future that sucks for him. And so I have just forced myself to remain optimistic that people are going to continue cranking away on this problem. And I do see folks all over the world coming up with more unique ideas. And I think the reality is it's easy to get cynical when you realize when you pay attention to how slowly things move. But I do think things are moving in a positive direction overall. I just think that um, we need to be willing to think about transformative adaptation. We're thinking about really changing the way that we live, changing our lifestyle to fit our coming realities. I do see people like my son will be willing to do that, I hope. And so there'll be hope for them. I just hope that we leave them with choices that they can work with and not lock them into a future where they have all the worst choices to make.
Right. Thank you so much. That's beautiful. This concludes today's webinar over the seawall, the delusion of controlling nature. I would like to offer our sincerest gratitude to Stephen for joining us today and for sharing his important work on this important issue. Thank you to everyone who attended and to John Coleman, who helps us make the webinars run smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a moment to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. Only those who indicate that they require a certificate during registration will receive one via email following the webinar, possibly tomorrow. Please keep an eye on your email box for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for listening today and have a great day.